Have you ever had that feeling that there's some kind of hidden logic connecting, well, everything? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on a framework that links the universe, our own minds, and even our emotions. It's like a master key.
I mean, it's a massive question, right? But what if there really was a set of principles that could help explain everything, from how our planet was formed to how we come up with new ideas, and even how we can manage our own feelings? That is exactly the journey we're going on today.
And any journey into how we think has to start with the absolute foundation, memory. And I'm not just talking about cramming facts for a test. Memory is the actual raw material our brain uses to build, well, everything else. And you know, what's so interesting is how different this is from what we learn in school. We're taught that logic is this clean, abstract thing. But in the real world, gosh, solving real problems depends on having a rich and, kind of messy collection of facts and experiences. Without that raw material, logic has nothing to work with. It's basically an engine with no fuel. So how do we get better at collecting all this material? Well, here are 3 amazing techniques that work with our brain's natural programming. First, our brains just love symmetry. Patterns are way easier to process. They also love modularization, which is just a fancy word for breaking big things into small groups. You know, like we all do with phone numbers. It just makes it easier on our brains. And finally, sequencing, which is basically turning information into a story, because our minds are literally built for narrative.
But maybe the most powerful trick of all is linking new information to something you already know. When you do that, you create what's called a retrieval queue, where pulling on one memory just brings another one right along with it. Come on, let's try it out right now.
Okay, just remember this number, 476 AD. This is the year the Western Roman Empire fell. It's a huge, pivotal moment in history. You got it? 476. Now here's our simple little retrieval cue, our little mental hook. We're just going to add 5. That's it. That's our link. And boom, here's the result. 481 AD. That's when the Merovingian dynasty was established, laying the groundwork for what would become modern France. Do you see what just happened there? By simply linking +5 to the fall of Rome, you've anchored a second major historical event. One fact just effortlessly pulls the other right into your memory. Pretty cool, right?
So once we have that raw material stored in our memory, how do we actually use it to create something totally new? This is where we move into the incredible world of creativity and emotion.
Now, the crucial thing to get here is that creativity isn't some kind of magical gift that only a few people have. Nope, it's a process. It's called distant association. And it's really the skill of finding connections between ideas that nobody else has seen before. It's exactly how the inventor of Velcro was inspired by the little burrs that got stuck to his dog's fur on a walk. Totally unrelated things suddenly connected. And to make those wild, distant connections, you often have to completely shift your perspective. You have to escape that flat, two-dimensional thinking and look at a problem from a completely new angle. This has got to be my favorite way to visualize this. Think about it. On a flat, 2D map, 2 intersecting roads can only lead to a car crash. It's a deadlock. But what happens if you add a third dimension, height? You get a highway interchange. The conflict is completely resolved and everything flows smoothly. That, right there, is high-dimensional thinking. Okay, so we've got memory as our raw material and creativity as our engine. But how do we actually put them into action to make things happen in the real world? Let's look at 3 super powerful forces we can all use to drive change and just speed up our learning. First up, the power of the situation. Just give yourself a tight deadline. It creates an incredible sense of urgency. Second, the power of questions. Instead of asking a million different things, try to find the one great question that unlocks the most insight. And third, my favorite, the power of process. You want to be a writer? The minimum unit isn't writing a whole chapter. It's just opening the laptop and typing one single word. You start that tiny process and you'll be amazed at how the system just takes over. This leads us to a really powerful idea, maybe the most efficient way to learn anything. It's this concept called decisive knowledge. And the idea is that any complex field, and I mean any field,
can be understood by just mastering one or two core foundational principles.
So take earth science. I mean, that seems impossibly complex, doesn't it? But it turns out almost everything in it can be understood through one single key idea: charge neutralization. It's just the simple fact that atoms really, really want to have a neutral charge.
Now check this out. This is where it gets incredible. This one simple rule basically explains our entire world. Okay, so oxygen has a charge of -2. So what does it do? It grabs two +1 hydrogens to become neutral water, and boom, you have our oceans. Or it grabs one +4 carbon to become neutral carbon dioxide, forming our atmosphere. Or it grabs one +4 silicon to become silicon dioxide, which is basically sand, the foundation of our continents. One rule explains 3 different spheres of our planet. That's amazing.
And that brings us to the grand finale. We can take this whole idea of decisive knowledge and expand it into 4 frameworks that can help us organize and understand, well, almost everything.
Pillar number 1 is set theory. Now, that sounds super academic, but it's actually incredibly simple. It just means we should categorize things. So instead of trying to observe a whale for hours to see if it breathes underwater, you just ask, what set does it belong to? Oh, it's a mammal. And what do we know about the mammal set? They all use lungs. Therefore, a whale can't breathe underwater. Problem solved in about 5 seconds.
Pillar 2 is all about relation. This is the idea that a true connection doesn't exist inside of a person, but between people. So think about this. A friend tells you about their awesome trip to Paris. A conversation stealer immediately jumps in with, "Oh, I went to Paris too, when I was there," and makes it about them. But a connection builder says, "Paris, that sounds incredible. What was your absolute favorite part?" See, they keep the spotlight on the other person, strengthening that relationship that exists in the space between them.
Pillar 3 is about understanding the huge difference between the physical and the phenomenal. A stone is a physical thing. It's just always there. But a typhoon? That's a phenomenon. It only appears when very specific conditions of temperature and pressure are met. Think about this now. Your brain is physical, but your consciousness, your emotions, those are phenomenal events. They flare up and they disappear based entirely on a set of conditions.
And our final pillar is paradox. The amazing poet Pablo Neruda once described clouds with his beautiful phrase, the futile abundance. I mean, it's a total contradiction, isn't it? How can something be both futile and abundant at the same time? But it's right there, in navigating that tension, that paradox, that we find beauty and meaning and real creativity. It's a kind of logic that actually welcomes contradiction.
So, let's bring all these big, abstract ideas right back home, into our own lives. If we use Pillar 3, and we start to see our emotions as being like those typhoons, phenomenal events that only happen under specific conditions, then maybe getting angry isn't some kind of moral failing. Maybe it's just a technical problem.
And this is the final thought I really want to leave you with today. If you start treating your emotions not as some deep character flaw, but as a system with inputs and outputs, how would you change things? How would you actually re-engineer your approach to frustration or sadness or even joy? Thinking about that is the real power of finding the underlying logic of everything.